Well, that beats everything I ever heard, she murmured tremulously. I could say nothing. I was too occupied with my own thoughts. Something in the music had instilled itself into my blood, or so I fancied, and the clinging, subtle sweetness of it moved me to strange emotions that were neither wise nor worthy of a man. I looked at Lady Sybil. She was very pale. Her eyes were cast down and her hands were trembling. On a sudden impulse, I rose and went to Romanes, where he still sat at the piano, his hands dumbly wandering over the keys. "You are a great master," I said, "a wonderful performer. But do you know what your music suggests?" He met my fixed gaze, shrugged his shoulders, and shook his head. "Crime," I whispered. "You aroused in me evil thoughts of which I am ashamed. I did not think that it was possible to do so divine in art." He smiled, and his eyes glittered with the steely brightness of stars on a wintry night. "Art takes its colors from the mind, my dear friend," he said. "If you discover evil suggestions in my music, the evil, I fear, must be in your own nature." "Or in yours," I said quickly. "Or in mine," he agreed coldly. "I have often told you I am no saint." I stood hesitatingly, looking at him. For one moment his great personal beauty appeared hateful to me, though I knew not why. Then the feeling of distrust and repulsion slowly passed, leaving me humiliated and abashed. "Pardon me, Lucio," I murmured regretfully. "I spoke in haste, but truly your music almost put me in a state of frenzy. I've never heard anything in the least like it." "Nor I," said Lady Sybil, who just then moved towards the piano. "It was marvelous. Do you know, it quite frightened me." "I am sorry," he answered with a penitent air. "I know I am quite a failure as a pianist. I am not sufficiently restrained, as the pressmen would say." "A failure? Good God!" exclaimed Lord Elton at this juncture. "Why, if you played like that in public, you'd drive everyone frantic." "With alarm?" queried Lucio, laughing, "or with disgust?" "Nonsense! You know what I mean very well. I have always had a contempt for the piano as an instrument. But, by Jove, I never heard such music as yours even in a full orchestra. It is extraordinary. It is positively magnificent. Where in the world did you study?" "In Nature's conservatory," replied Romanes lazily. "My first maestro was an amiable nightingale. He, singing on a branch of fir when the moon was full, explained with liquid-noted patience how to construct and produce a pure rondellade, cadenza, and trill. And when I had learned thus far, he showed me all the most elaborate methods of applying rhythmic tune to the upward and downward rush of the wind, thus supplying me with perfect counterpoint. Chords I learned from old Neptune, who was good enough to toss a few of his largest billows to the shore for my special benefit. He nearly deafened me with his instructions, being somewhat excitable and loud-voiced, but on finding me an apt pupil, he drew back his waves to himself with so much delicacy among the pebbles and sand that at once I mastered the secret of playing arpeggi. Once, too, I had a finishing lesson from a dream, a mystic thing with wild hair and wings. It sang one word in my ears, and the word was unpronounceable in mortal speech. But after many efforts I discovered it lurking in the scale of sound. The best part of it all was that my instructors asked no fees." "I think you are a poet as well as a musician," said Lady Sybil. "A poet! Spare me! My dear lady, why are you so cruel to load me with so vile an imputation? Better be a murderer than a poet. One is treated with much more respect and courteous consideration by the press, at any rate. The murderer's breakfast menu will be given due place in many of the most estimable journals, but the poet's lack of both breakfast and dinner will be deemed his fitting reward. Call me a livestock producer, a horse breeder, a timber merchant, anything but a poet. Why, even Tennyson became an amateur milkman to somewhat conceal and excuse the shame and degradation of writing verse." We all laughed. "Well, you must admit," said Lord Elton, "that we've had rather too much of poets lately. It's no wonder we're sick of them, and that poetry has fallen into disrepute. Poets are such a quarrelsome lot, too, effeminate, pulling, unmanly humbugs." You are speaking of the newly discovered ones, of course, said Lucio. Yes, they are a weedy collection. I have sometimes thought that out of pure philanthropy, I would start a bonbon manufactory and employ them to write mottos for the crackers. It would keep them out of mischief and provide them with a little pocket money, for as matters stand, they do not make a farthing by their books. But I do not call them poets at all. They are mere rhymers. One or two real poets do exist, but like the prophets of Scripture, they are not in society, nor can they get their logs rolled by any of their contemporaries. They are not favorites with any set. That is why I am afraid my dear Tempest will never be accepted as the genius he is. Society will be too fond of him to let him go down into the dust and ashes to gather the laurel. It's not necessary to go down into dust and ashes for that, I said. I assure you it is, he answered gaily. Positively imperative. The laurel flourishes best so. It will not grow in a hothouse. At that moment, Diana Chesney approached. Lady Elton would like to hear you sing, Prince, she said. Will you give us that pleasure? Do. Something quite simple, you know. It will set our nerves straight after your terribly beautiful music. You'd hardly believe it, perhaps, but I really feel quite unstrung. He folded his hands with a droll air of penitence. Forgive me, he said. I'm as always, as the church service says, doing things I ought not to do. Miss Chesney laughed, a trifle nervously. Oh, I forgive you, she replied, on condition that you sing. I obey. And with that he tuned again to the piano, and playing a strange wild minor accompaniment, sang the following stanzas. Sleep, my beloved, sleep. Be patient, we shall keep our secret closely hid beneath the coffin lid. There is no other place on earth or air for such a love as ours, or such despair. And neither heaven nor hell shall care to win our loathed souls rejoicing in their sin. Sleep, for my hand is sure, the cold steel bright and pure strikes through thy heart and mine, shedding our blood like wine. Sin's sweetness is too sweet, and if the shame of our love must be our curse, we hurl the blame back on the gods who gave us love with breath, and tortured us from passion into death. This strange song, sung in the most glorious of baritones, not really, full and rich and vibrating with power and sweetness, had a visibly thrilling effect upon us all. Again we were struck dumb with surprise and something like fear, and again Diana Chesney broke the silence. You call that simple? She said, half petulantly. Quite so. Love and death are the simplest things in the world, replied Lucio. The ballad is a mere trifle. It is entitled The Last Love Song, and it is supposed to be the utterance of a lover about to kill his mistress and himself. Such events happen every day, you know that by the newspapers. They are perfectly commonplace. He was interrupted by a sharp, clear voice ringing imperatively across the room. Where did you learn that song? End of chapter 13 of The Srrws of Satan.